The gun, a weapon that has defined warfare in the 20th century. But the gun was born in the ancient world. Some of the deadliest weapons ever made were prototypes of the modern gun. Who invented the world's first firearm, and did it defend an entire civilization from invasion? How did this mega mortar help defeat the English monarchy? Does an ingenious secret recipe for early tracer fire really work? Could ancient cannonballs leave soldiers dead with no visible sign of injury? And did this multi-barreled weapon signal the birth of the world's first machine gun? The tactics, technology, and impact of ancient guns and ammo is our ancient discovery. The gun has dominated the battlefield for over 1,000 years, destroying impenetrable fortresses and annihilating entire armies. But could the first gun have been made from little more than bamboo and string? In the 13th century, ancient Chinese military engineers faced their biggest challenge to date: to develop a weapon that might save their entire country.
The great crisis for Chinese civilization in the Middle Ages was the invasion of the Mongols. The conquest of China had always been the ultimate ambition for the men who ruled the Central Asian steppes. By comparison with the barren grasslands of Mongolia, China was a land of plenty.
Under Genghis Khan and his clan, the Mongol Empire gradually pushed further southwards into Chinese territory.
If the Mongols succeeded in their ambition of conquering the whole of China, this would make them the greatest power that the world has ever seen.
But the Chinese put up serious resistance to the Mongol invasion.
He'd had very large cities of over 1 million people, large manufacturing industries, centralised government, and a system for government funding of research and development, which we find much more familiar today than most of their contemporaries would have done.
The Chinese war machine stepped up a gear. Military engineers began urgently experimenting. Amongst the weapons they developed in an attempt to keep the Mongol hordes at bay was the fire lance. A report of the defense of the northern capital Kaifeng in 1232 described the use of the new weapon. Filled with gunpowder, upon ignition the flames suddenly shot forward more than 10 paces and no one dared go near them.
We hear of the Chinese defenders using fire lances, and they're described as being one of the few weapons that the Mongols were really afraid of.
Richard Windley is investigating the development of this weapon, which marked the first step in the evolution of the gun. At first it was not designed to shoot projectiles, it was simply a bamboo tube fixed to a handle.
So basically we've got this tube, we've knocked out the little sealing sector inside, so we've actually got a tube, smoothed it out with a wooden dowel and some abrasive paper. So we've got a reasonably smooth bore, and then this would have been filled with a incendiary mixture. Now this is going to be something like a simple firework mixture. So basically what we've got is a firework on a stick. It's a rather nasty firework, but that's basically what we've got.
But records reveal that the Chinese took the fire lance a step further, using it to fire projectiles for the first time. It's not known whether this was by accident or design, but it marked a turning point in weapons history.
In 1259 we have a reference to a fire lance which actually shot out projectiles as well as flames. This is probably the first instance of the development of the true gun.
Almost every gun is based on the same simple concept.
All guns have 3 major components: a barrel, open at one end, a projectile to do the damage, and a charge to provide the explosive force. When the charge is detonated, it produces 3,000 times its own volume of gas. This explosive force pushes the projectile down the length of the barrel, out of the end and towards its target.
Richard has adapted his fire lance to fire projectiles, binding it to give it additional strength.
As soon as we put a gunpowder charge in a tube like this, and then load projectiles on top of it, when that gunpowder goes off, it's producing a prodigious quantity of gas and very, very high pressures. Now, although bamboo's strong, it probably wouldn't withstand those pressures, so it's got to be bound with something to strengthen it.
Richard binds his bamboo tube tightly with string, But will this be enough for it to survive a test fire?
To date, we've not actually found any information as to a reconstruction of this device in modern times. So really it's very instructive to build one of these and test it in the field and see what kind of result we get.
Richard prepares to test fire his replica.
What we're going to do is we're going to try loading this with different charges and with different projectiles. If we can get a medium-sized charge in here and a projectile and the barrel withstand that pressure, then we know that we've got a usable and functional weapon.
First, the barrel is filled with a handful of small stones, most probably the first projectiles that were used in a fire lance. Not knowing how it will react, Richard rigs the fire lance so he can fire it remotely.
That was brilliant. We had about 1.5 ounces of powder that time. There appears to be no damage or no perceivable damage to the tube, which is interesting. I'm very, very surprised at that. These things look as though they're going to be a lot stronger than I originally anticipated. So we may have a viable weapon here. We'll better have a look and see if we've done some damage to the mannequin there. Well, I'm absolutely astounded at this. It's absolutely peppered the mannequin. As you can see, the entire torso has been impacted with these little bits of sharp gravel. I think this is getting very close to something that's actually fatal.
Having successfully fired a handful of gravel and survived, can this ancient bamboo proto-gun actually be used to fire a single projectile, just like a modern gun? Richard is doubtful.
This is another ball game really, because we're generating massive pressures in that case, and it's very unlikely bamboo would survive, and it needs a really well-made metal barrel to actually survive what's called an occluded projectile, which means it fills the entire barrel with very little room to spare.
The weapon is loaded with a single stone ball. It's a direct hit.
We didn't quite hit him on the heart, but not far off. I don't know where the ball's gone, but that's where it went in. The ball's... Oh no, it went right through. Went straight through out the other side. This stretchy fabric was enough to stop. There we go. It went right through. I think we can safely say this guy would have either been dead or have been seriously out of action.
But did the gun stand up to the test?
It does seem as though there's a small split opened up in the barrel, but the hemp string binding seems to have held everything together. We've actually learned quite a lot from this experiment. Certainly it's very, very surprising how strong this stuff is, even with a simple one-string binding.
This program has shown that the primitive fire lance made simply of bamboo and string was strong enough to fire a single projectile, just like a modern gun.
Well, in lots of ways, a single solid projectile, which is occluding, brings us very much up to date with most modern guns, certainly in the last century or two, things like muskets.
A powerful weapon, but only really accurate at short range.
The fire lance certainly seems to have been an effective weapon in hand-to-hand combat, but because it's very short range, it was not usually decisive. It was probably most effective in defending cities, walls, and similar enclosed spaces.
But the fire lance could not keep the Mongols out of China. They stole the technology and used it for themselves. The Chinese lost their tactical advantage, and by 1279, the Mongol conquest of China was complete.
The fall of China to the Mongols was obviously a disaster for many millions of people involved. It placed China under a brutal foreign domination for about a century. On the other hand, it also made China part of an empire that spanned half the world and brought the country and its civilization to the knowledge of Europe.
The empire that created the world's first gun was crushed, but the Mongols would take the knowledge of this new weapon beyond the borders of China and into Europe. The gun had made its debut on the battlefield. From the earliest days of firearms to the modern world of high-tech sighting systems, gunners have always found it difficult to aim in the dark. When you can't see your target, hitting it is a matter of luck. But hidden in an early gunpowder manual is the description of an ingenious tactic used by ancient gunners to fire cannon at night. Was this the world's first tracer fire? Throughout history, gunners have found it difficult to aim in the dark. Today, tracer bullets are used to mark out the line of fire in the night sky. But could a similar tactic have first been used over 500 years ago? This program will uncover whether instructions hidden in a secret military manual hold the key to the world's first tracer fire. In 1456, the Turkish Sultan Mehmed II laid siege to the city of Belgrade in the Hungarian Empire.
Mehmed's aim was to capture Belgrade, which was the key crossing point of the Danube. By capturing Belgrade, it would mean that the Ottomans had penetrated the line of fortresses on the southern frontier of Hungary and would have easy access to the heartland of Central Europe. In no time at all, they would have been at the gates of Vienna.
On the 4th of July, the great Turkish cannon opened fire on the city walls. The bombardment continued into the night.
Early cannon took a very long time to reload, largely to let the cannon cool down before you dared put any more gunpowder in it. So you tend to fire right through the 24-hour cycle. It was also rather cooler at night, so in the Mediterranean or the Middle East, you would prefer using guns at night, they'd cool quicker.
The continuous attack prevented the defenders from repairing their walls. But how did the Turks hit their targets in the dark?
There's very little advantage in firing at night because if you can't see the fall of shot, you can't see what advantage or otherwise your firing is having.
The answer may lie in an ancient text on early gunpowder, a 14th century German military manual known as the Firework Book. Copies of this book are some of the earliest surviving texts on gunpowder in Europe. Gunpowder historian Bob Smith is investigating a copy held in the vaults of the Royal Armouries in Leeds.
Well, this is one of a group of firework books. They were produced from the end of the 14th century, and they were actually made for about 200 years.
The book is written like a training manual, giving practical instruction on gunpowder and gunnery, along with full-scale illustrations.
What they are actually is instructions on how to make gunpowder, how to make incendiary devices, and how to fire guns. They're incredibly important because they give us all this information about gunpowder and cannon in a period where we have no other way of getting information.
Having been copied so many times by different people into different languages, some experts fear that much has been lost in the translation. Bob thinks otherwise.
It used to be thought that they weren't perhaps that reliable. I'm coming to the conclusion actually there's a lot of sense in them and they are very reliable.
Among the tips and tricks offered is an excellent method whereby a master can shoot a gun at night and yet know where he has fired.
It's been compared to having like a tracer shot, so you can see where it goes. Of course, you only get the one shot rather than the many shots you do with tracer. But it gives you some information that they were actually trying to see where their cannonballs were going at night.
Tracer fire is a common sight on the news today, lighting up the night skies over modern battlefields. The GPMG, General Purpose Machine Gun, fires one round of tracer to 5 bullets to help the gunners see where they're aiming at night. But could medieval gunners have really invented a form of tracer fire over 500 years ago? Ancient Discoveries is going to test whether a cannon can really fire a flaming cannonball.
You sit here, being, in an academic world thinking, will these things work? But actually, it's not until you actually go and try it out, as I've found a lot in the past, that you really can tell.
Bob is teaming up with cannon expert Colin Herriot, who has over 20 years' experience of medieval gunnery.
We know from the firework book that they actually refer to flaming cannonballs, which they're using rather like tracer shots, so they can see actually where their shots go at night.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
But I've never seen this tried before. How have you made these?
Well, I tried as much as possible to stick to the recipe, Bob, from the firework book. I got a stone cannonball or gunstone, coated it in pitch, let it cool down, and then sprinkled it liberally with gunpowder, wrapped the whole thing in a cloth and tied it up with cordage. Yeah. And then when we're going to fire it, we're going to cover it with lard and tallow. So we've got the combustible nature of pitch, gunpowder and tallow. Hopefully, put them all together, this will make a flaming missile.
The theory is that when the gunpowder ignites, the cannonball will be set alight and, more importantly, stay lit until it lands. Having coated the stone balls in tar and gunpowder, Colin's final touch is to smear them with tallow or pig fat before loading the gun.
Firing, give him fire!
The cannon fires the ball 200 yards. The combustible mixture catches light as the ball leaves the barrel, and on hitting the ground, the ball is clearly visible in the dark.
Well, it certainly worked. It's burning really well. The incendiary, the tallow and the gunpowder you put in really makes it really burn.
Yeah, it's quite fierce.
Yeah, and it worked both as a sort of trace of round, as we thought, and it's also seemed to have worked as an incendiary. It would set light to whatever it landed on.
Anything it touched, really quite phenomenal.
We've discovered that the formula works. So could the Turkish gunners in the 15th century have used this tactic?
One of the reasons we know Mehmet as Mehmet the Conqueror is because he picked up artillery early on. This is a man who takes all the latest technology and uses it very effectively.
It was Mehmet's appreciation and understanding of the gun that helped to make the Ottoman Empire one of the largest and most powerful in history. Flaming cannonballs may have been a good way to hit your target in the dark, but they still relied on line of sight. In siege warfare, the target was often hidden behind heavily defended outer walls. A new cannon was forged to conquer an impenetrable castle in a war that tore England apart. It was the largest cannon forged in the English Civil War, a mortar built to fire 200-pound cannonballs. What would it have been like to face this terrifying weapon? And how did it help bring down the English monarchy? Now a team of experts are discovering the truth behind the legend of Roaring Meg. In the middle of the 17th century, the fate of the English monarchy hung in the balance. The king, Charles I, was out of touch with the expectations and beliefs of his subjects.
Charles I's two weaknesses were, first, he wanted a different kind of religion from many of his subjects. He loved ceremony, beauty, hierarchies. He loved cathedrals, bishops, stained glass, music, whereas a lot of people wanted preaching and the Bible. And he also didn't believe in communicating with his subjects. He really thought that they should obey him because he had their best interests at heart.
In 1642, civil war broke out between forces loyal to the king and the Parliament. The king's forces gradually began to lose ground, and by May 1646 only a few royalist strongholds survived. One of these was Goodrich Castle. The historian Ronald Hutton has come to Goodrich to investigate the siege.
The parliamentarians can't allow Goodrich to go on. It's a national symbol of defiance. It's a beacon for anybody who wants to care for the king and go on fighting for him. And it's a high road into England for reinforcements from abroad. It can't be allowed to stand.
Inside the castle, Sir Henry Lingen, a committed royalist, was holed up with a garrison of 200 men. Outside its walls, a parliamentarian army led by Colonel John Birch prepared to attack.
There are two ways you can take out a castle. One is to starve it out, and the other is to smash a hole in it. But both are very difficult. Henry Lingen's had an entire winter to lay up stocks of food. He's got months left inside. And Goodrich's a hard nut to crack. The only way in the end to get Goodrich is to smash it open, and that takes an awful lot of gunpowder.
But Goodrich's outer walls were too solid to be demolished by cannon.
The curtain walls are 60 to 70 feet in height. Smashing the curtains is difficult because they are banked behind with timber and with earth.
The only way to bring down the castle would be to destroy it from within.
The only way in the end you can get into this castle is to take a tower out, and that has to be done from above by raining in mortar shells. You blow the roof in, and the next shell will take out the floor below until the castle is hollowed out.
To do this, Birch ordered the casting of a mortar, specifically designed to fire shells high enough so that they cleared the outer defences of the castle. He named it Roaring Meg. The original survives and is still on display at Goodrich Castle. But just how effective was the mortar, and how much of the castle could it have destroyed?
We can't test Roaring Meg, so we damage her by firing. But if you make an exact copy, you can discover how high you can get a grenade, a projectile, a shell, how far it'll land, things you simply cannot learn any other way.
Ancient Discoveries expert Ian Henn has built a replica. It's identical to the original in every detail.
The replica that we built here was as close as we could possibly get to the original in its current state. Even the fact that the wall thickness varies around the muzzle, the same as the original, and all the imperfections, as far as we could do, were built in to make it as close as we possibly could a dimensionally accurate copy. It should give us a very accurate idea of range and power of what the original achieved in the Siege of Goodrich.
To test it, Ian and his team have brought the replica to a firing range in the south of England.
We don't know whether the mortar would have actually achieved a complete spread of the castle, but from the range that we achieved today, we should be able to discover how far inside the castle they could have got with the mortar bombs.
Ballistics expert Tony Musty is helping work out how high the mortar could have fired and whether it could have cleared the outer walls. It's fixed to fire upwards at an angle of 45 degrees, just as the original would have been.
With a mortar, 45 degrees gives you the perfect trajectory to get the maximum amount of height.
Knowing the angle, the height of each shot can be calculated from measuring the range.
Generally speaking, the height that it will achieve will be a quarter of the range the ball travels.
Once the mortar is fired, Tony and Ian carefully measure the distance between the landing point and the gun. The result is disappointing.
It only measures 167 feet. I find fault with your wadding, Mr. Hen.
It really has come quite a bit short now. A lot shorter than I would have expected.
Having measured its range, Tony can now calculate whether it would have cleared Goodrich's outer walls.
Well, how do we get on, Tony, then? Would that have got it in the castle?
167 feet, which at 45 degrees gives us about 40 feet up. That doesn't quite make it in, but it still hit the castle.
So I think we'll try a bit more wad in for the next shot and try and wad it all back a bit harder.
Straw wadding is used to contain the gunpowder when it ignites, producing a more violent explosion and a greater range.
Crikey, that's quite a shot.
Yeah, it is, yeah. It's landed back there and rolled in, what, about 15 yards, Tony?
I should say so.
Yep. OK, well, we really need to measure from the landing point back to the mortar and work out its exact range.
Yeah. Righto, you're the boss.
OK.
The longest one had numbers which were exactly twice the shortest one, so that flew right in. 360 odd feet and 80 feet up, I would think.
I think that just proves that gun really was as effective as Colonel said it was in his memoirs.
Yeah, he'd have been a happy man.
With the projectiles gaining an average of 1 foot of elevation for every 2 feet travelled as it leaves the bore, the cannonball reaches a maximum height in the air of 80 feet. This would have cleared the curtain wall of Goodrich Castle by over 20 feet. The cannon's terrifying blast would have shaken the castle's inhabitants to the core.
Mortar fire has a particularly frightening characteristic that it doesn't come from an obvious place that you can see. It comes from a distant place, it comes from above. It's essentially an indirect weapon, so you can't see who's firing at you. So it's something that can be quite unsettling, particularly for civilians, but even for professional soldiers.
Birch himself was so excited with his creation that he personally fired 19 of the 22 shots. In this account of the siege, he described how he had torn the castle with my mortar piece that no whole room was left in it.
The exterior is smashed by heavy cannon, pounding at the walls, and the interior is blown open by mortar shells, and the two together is more than a medieval castle can stand. The entire outer wall splits and slides into the ditch, leaving the castle laid open and bare.
After 6 weeks of heavy bombardment, the Royalists surrendered. Elsewhere around the country, further death blows were being dealt to the Royalist cause. The king himself had been taken prisoner. By 1648, the war was over. The following year, Charles I was executed for high treason. Never again would a king rule England without Parliament's consent. Cannon weren't only used to bring down castles, they were also highly effective against infantry.
We are talking about a devastating kind of weapon that no one had ever seen before, and it caused appalling destruction on the battlefields of Europe.
Projectiles fired from a gun barrel hit the body with unprecedented force, causing atrocious injuries. In most cases, the cause of death was obvious, but amidst the reports are descriptions of men killed by a cannonball which didn't even touch them. Throughout history, stories of bizarre phenomena and strange deaths have haunted the battlefield. None are more mysterious than the legendary Wind of the Cannonball, in which men were reportedly killed by a cannonball that didn't even touch them.
The wind of the cannonball is a very odd phenomenon, and we have it described, first of all, in the 1540s.
There are accounts over the years of people reporting that actually they saw a cannonball, passed by somebody, not apparently touched them, but that person dropped dead. And then when the person was examined, there was no sign of external injury.
What really caused these deaths? How is it possible for a cannonball to kill someone without leaving any sign of injury? For the first time, a team of experts are piecing together the evidence to discover the truth behind the mystery of the Wind of the Cannonball. When aimed directly at enemy troops, cannon cut down the tightly packed infantry formations common in the medieval period.
If you had an individual wandering around the battlefield, he would be a difficult target for an artilleryman to hit. But certainly if you had a group of pikemen, musketeers, whomsoever, advancing, and you fire your artillery piece into them, then you have not only the man in front, but many behind him who will be affected by it.
To find out just how much damage direct cannon fire can cause, a test using multiple pig carcasses from a local butcher's shop has been set up. Can a cannonball penetrate all four from 50 foot away? The cannonball tears through the pig flesh, causing horrific damage and punching clean through all the carcasses. There's no doubt that when cannonballs made a direct hit on a human body, they caused extensive internal and external injuries.
When a cannonball hits somebody, it's usually pretty obvious because it's either left a massive hole in them, or you just see a mess of organs, or their heads being decapitated.
But what if it was not a direct hit? Stories of Wind of the Cannonball tell of balls that passed by men and still managed to kill them. One witness describes the death of a soldier during the Napoleonic Wars. A cannon shot from the enemy came whistling past him and he fell lifeless on the spot. The blood started out of his nose and ears, but with the exception of this, there was neither wound nor bruise on his body.
So let's imagine that the cannonball hits the chest.
Dr. Rob Hicks and computer analyst James Dean are using the latest 3D modelling techniques to investigate how a cannonball might hit the body side on, skimming off it to cause a fatal but invisible injury.
3D modelling is a fantastic way of exploring this sort of phenomena because, for one reason, you don't need to use live people or live animals, so it's less messy and more humane. But you can also play around with the theories. You can test theory after theory. You can move the image of the cannonball to see what might happen at certain angles, at certain forces, at certain velocities.
So we've set up a simulation here with a cannonball coming in, and it's striking the body here. It's not punching straight through. It's a glancing blow, and the cannonball heads off in a different direction.
The simulation shows that in glancing off the body, a cannonball would not necessarily puncture the skin. Instead, Rob thinks it would have caused an injury known today as blunt force trauma.
The common times when blunt force trauma occurs in modern day, car accidents or in brawls or fights, when somebody receives a punch to the abdomen, for example.
Serious internal injury can be caused without penetrating the surface of the skin.
The skin is really very elastic. It's what allows us to push and pull and prod it without causing any injury. And as the cannonball is coming across and you're getting that glancing blow, the skin may not be damaged, but the force behind is enough to damage the organs that's sitting behind the skin.
Internal organs behind the skin can rupture on impact.
The bleeding can be really very profuse and somebody can die very, very quickly without leaving any external trace of there ever being an injury to start with. Here we have the lungs.
A sudden jolt to the upper chest could be equally fatal.
The cannonball may just hit the area of the heart and stop it. The guy has a cardiac arrest, drops down dead. Or it might be that actually it causes damage to the aorta. This is the large blood vessel, the large artery, where the blood from the heart enters, gets taken down through the artery to the rest of the body.
Yeah, we can simulate a rip in the aorta like this.
You'll see there, blood isn't going to go through the aorta now, it's just going to come pumping out and people will die within seconds because of that bleeding. Again, probable, no sign of external injury.
Having established the cause of death, James and Rob take a look at the path of the cannonball from different viewpoints on the battlefield to discover why an eyewitness might have failed to see the ball hit its victim.
If we move the model around and look at it from the top, we can see the deflection in the path. However, if we were standing on the battlefield at the same level as this guy who's being hit, then all of a sudden it's much harder to spot the change in direction there.
That's really amazing, because looking at it from this perspective, imagine I'm a soldier in the field, I'm seeing that cannonball drift across and apparently not touch that soldier. I go and take a look, probably can't see any sign that he's been injured, he's just simply dropped down dead. I think what we're seeing here is a very good explanation for the wind of the cannonball.
The 3D modelling has shown that it's possible for a cannonball to have bounced off the body, causing an invisible but fatal injury. Most guns rely on a more direct hit to be effective. To improve their hit rate, some are designed to fire multiple rounds in quick succession. The most common example today is the machine gun. But could the first idea for such a gun have had its origins as far back as the 14th century? Firing an endless stream of bullets, the machine gun tore through infantry formations and transformed modern warfare.
The modern machine gun is an anti-personnel weapon designed to lay down a large amount of lethal fire to stop the movement of men and, in the early days, horses as well.
On D-Day in June 1944, 130,000 Allied soldiers were pinned down by German machine gun emplacements. 600 years before, an English king, Edward III, had landed on those same Normandy shores to lay claim to the throne of France. His army carried with it some of the first guns used in European warfare, and among them was what could be called the earliest version of the machine gun. Ancient Discoveries expert Andrew Ayton is investigating the real impact of this secret weapon in the battle for France.
There are striking parallels between Edward III's landing in Normandy in 1346 and that of D-Day 600 years later. The most significant being that they were both huge maritime operations, amphibious landings on a vast scale, and also, of course, they were both mounted against a hostile coast.
A young and ambitious king, Edward wanted to assert his dominance in Europe.
He had been at war with the King of France for 10 years, during which time he had fought a series of frustrating and indecisive campaigns in various corners of the French kingdom. In 1346, he had been pressed by the political elite of England to come to France and bring the war to a head.
To achieve this aim, Edward had ordered the manufacture of a weapon known as a ribauldequin.
Ribauldequin is a multi-barreled gun. It's a gun that discharges lots of shot at the enemy, possibly very simple to start with, just some barrels tied to a gate or something of that description, and they found out that by firing them off quickly you could seriously distress the enemy if they were attacking you.
Weapons expert Colin Herriot has researched and built a working replica of Edward's multi-barreled gun.
You have to use your imagination and what knowledge that you can glean from the old writings. I had some of the barrels built for it and then forged some myself to finish off the 9 that I wanted, and basically built it from scratch.
The move from single to multi-barrel guns was an inspired step for medieval cannon makers.
Early gunpowder weapons have at least a 15% chance of misfiring. Gunpowder soaks up moisture, so if you've got more than one barrel, that increases your chances of shooting something. If one misfires, you've got the others, and you can let fly with those. Your chances of survival are heightened.
March on!
And Edward's army needed any advantage it could muster. By the 26th of August, 1346, they had advanced east from Normandy as far as the village of Crécy. The the English were outnumbered 4-1 and facing the finest heavy cavalry in northern Europe.
The army that Edward faces at Crécy was an imposing force. There may well have been as many as 12,000 heavy cavalrymen, that is, heavily armoured mounted troops, facing Edward on the evening of the battle.
Back in England, Colin prepares to put his gun to the test against a formation of soldier-sized targets. How many can it hit, and what damage will it do?
In each barrel we're going to put down about a dozen bullets, 54 caliber lead bullets, and we're going to fire the central barrel, and hopefully the fire will spread across with a gunpowder trail and ignite all the barrels and pepper the targets.
After loading all 9 barrels and preparing the gunpowder trail, Colin is ready to fire the Ribauldequin for the first time.
We seem to have made a bit of a mess of these gentlemen.
Well, yes, multiple wounds.
Yeah, well, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 holes in that one. And you've got at least a dozen here. Some of his legs been blown away there. And you've got several in the man behind who thought he was safe.
Gone right through.
And wasn't.
The gun fires 108 shots in less than a second.
If we open fire at 200 yards with these, and they're advancing on foot, say, that we would probably get about, I don't know, maybe 5, 6, maybe even more discharges off.
Yes.
The amount of metal which is thrown into the enemy in a short period of time would be totally disconcerting. If you weren't hit, wounded or killed, you would be terrified by the amount of men that would be knocked down around you.
Firing multiple rounds in quick succession would have helped give Edward's soldiers the edge over the enemy that far outnumbered them, breaking up the French formations and forcing them to retreat and take cover.
If these multi-barreled guns were used, this would have given the English a tremendous advantage. We're really right at the start of the battle.
But the French at Crécy were not unprotected. This was the age of the knight, when noblemen went into battle in full armour. To find out whether the Ribauldequin could have penetrated steel armour, Colin prepares to fire it at a 14-gauge steel breastplate.
Well, we had 1-inch balls in the 3 central barrels, and we fired 54 and 44 caliber balls in the outside 6. And it's one of these which has struck this, punched a hole clean through, broke the mannequin in half. If he was an armoured man,
he's gone down.
He'd be a very dead armoured man, wouldn't he?
In slow motion, the full impact of the hit is revealed.
And we're accustomed to thinking about this kind of impact in the early 16th century, but this could have happened at Crécy in the 1340s is extraordinary, isn't it?
Yeah, nothing is new, is it?
No, it isn't.
On the battlefield at Crécy, the Ribauldequin may well have contributed to the chaos that broke out amongst the French army. The French losses at Crécy were crippling. Amongst the dead were over 1,000 men-at-arms. The King of France himself was injured and had 2 horses killed under him. Edward's victory was a turning point in history, establishing English military supremacy in Europe.
It was victory and defeat on a grand scale. The greatest army in Christendom is defeated by a comparatively small expeditionary force from an offshore island of Europe.
Meanwhile, the gun would become a familiar sight in Renaissance warfare. It marked the end for the knight.
When a peasant with a musket can kill the most proficient professional knight on horseback, all of a sudden the numbers don't stack up.
Over time, the ancient ways of doing battle with sword, bow and lance were consigned to history. And a new modern world emerged in which battles were fought and won with the gun. From the first guns of ancient China to the massive mortars and multi-barreled guns of medieval Europe, history has been shaped by the technology and tactics of guns and ammo.